Hello! In our previous tutorial, we learned how to create arrays in Java. In this tutorial, we are going to learn about loops. Loops are very useful if we want to do something repetitively. For example, we have created an integer array, grades, which contains 5 integer grades. If we want to print out all the grades one by one, then we can use a for loop. The syntax for for loop goes like this. The for keyword, parenthesis. Inside, there are 3 parts. The first part is called initializer. We can have an integer and declare variable I. We can initiate into 0 and with a semicolon. The second part is called a tester. We are going to check some condition to decide whether we are going to execute the for loop or not. Here, we are going to check whether I is less than 5. The third part is called the updater. We are going to make some change to the variable. In this case, I'm going to increase the value of variable I by 1. Inside the body of the for loop, we can add some statements. Here, I'm just going to ask the system to print out each element of the grades array in a separated line. To access each array, I'm going to use index. I can just use the variable I to access. Now let's run the program. Here's the output. It prints out each grade in a separated line. That works. Now I want to show you an enhanced for loop, which is available for Java 5 and up. In this for loop, we are just going to use a variable, and we can call it grade, and column, and specify the array name. Inside the for loop, we're going to do the same thing, print out. We are just going to specify the name of the variable we created in the for statement, grade. So what we're doing here is telling the system, okay, take the integer array grades. I'm going to traverse to array and take each element and print out the element value. Grade is used as a local variable to receive the values of each element when we traverse the array. Now let's run the code. Okay, both for loop printed out the elements of the array in a separated line. For loop is the most commonly used loop. Besides for loop, we have while loop. Now let's look at an example of a while loop. We have an integer count and we assign a value 1 to the variable. Now in a while loop, we are going to check whether count is greater than 0 and whether count is not equal to 10. Alright, so the ban and the equal sign stands for not equal to. And inside the while loop, we are going to print out the value of count. And we are going to increase the count by 1. Alright, so what this while loop does is it will check the condition whether count is greater than 0 and whether count is not equal to 10. If this is evaluated to true, then we're going to run the statements inside the while loop. We'll first print out the value of count, then increase the value of count by 1. It's important that you will update the value, so at some point this expression will be evaluated to false, so the while loop will exit. Otherwise, you will get an infinite loop. Now let's run the code. Here's the output. it prints out 1, 2, 3 up to 9, one number at each 9. Okay, so if I comment out this updater statement, I will get an infinite loop. If you don't believe me, let's run the code. We get an infinite loop. It's printing out 1 infinitely and still going. And this is not a good idea. So let's stop the program, and always remember you should change the condition so at some point for your loop to exit. Besides while loop, there is another type of loop called do while. Now I'm going to output a line saying, now I'm adding a do while loop. So inside the do while loop, I'm going to print out the variable count. At the end of the do while loop, I'm going to check the exactly same condition as the while loop. Inside the do while loop, in the body, I'm going to add one more thing. I'm going to decrease the value of count by 1 for every repetition of the loop. And I have changed the initial value of count to 10. Now, do you think the while loop will be executed? Well, it shouldn't, because count equals to 10, and this expression will be evaluated to false. So we should not enter this while loop. How about the do while? Now let's run the code. Here's the output. Okay, so the while loop didn't execute. And after the do while loop begins, it prints out the number from 10 down to 1 and stopped. The do while loop entered because it's post-checked. So the do while loop will run at least once. We will execute the loop before we check the condition. Inside the loop, the value of variable count will be decreased. So by the time it reaches this statement, the value of count becomes 9, and this becomes true. So it will come back and repeat it for another time until count equals to 0, and this will be evaluated to false. Then do while loop exits. Conditionals is also very important in Java programming. Conditionals, the if-else statement, are used to make decisions. We can use a standalone if statement, or we can use if-else statement to provide 2 options. If we have more options than 2, we can use if, else if to form chained statements. Let's modify the while loop. I'm going to change the initial value of count back to 1, then add a conditional inside the while loop. At the beginning of the while loop, I'm going to increase count by 1, and at the end of the while loop, I'm going to print out the value of count. In between, I'm going to add an if-else statement. If count mod 2 equals 0, so this is saying, hey, if the remainder of count divided by 2 equals to 0, which means if count is an even number, I am going to print out the message saying count plus even to indicate this is an even number. Else, if count equals 0, then I'm going to print out count can be divided by 5. Okay, now let's run the program. Here's the output of the while loop. It will start by printing out 2 indicating its even number, and it goes to the end of the while loop, print out the value of the variable count, and then goes back, recheck the condition. All right, and it satisfies the condition. This expression is evaluated to true, so it enters, and this time count will be increased to value 3, and it will check the if statement, so it doesn't satisfy here, so it will skip to else if, and this is evaluated to false, so it will skip and come to the end. It will print out the value of count, and it goes back again, and this time the expression is still true, so while loop will be executed again, and count this time will be updated to 4. 4 can be divided by 2, so the if statement is executed. Whenever the if statement is executed, the else if will be skipped, so it will come directly to the end of the program and prints out the value of 4, so on and so forth. So that's how if and else if works. Now, there is a keyword called continue, and there is another keyword called break. I am going to show you how they work. So basically, the keyword continue, if you put inside a loop, it will skip the rest of the loop body and goes back to recheck the condition. Alright, for example, if I put continue inside the if statement, the flow will change. If the while statement condition is evaluated to true, it will first increase the value of count by 1, and then if it's an even number, it will print out the even number, but it will skip the rest of the statements, which means it will no longer print out the even number by itself. Instead, it will go directly to the beginning of the while loop and recheck the condition. Let's run the program. Alright, here's the output. We can see that for even numbers, it only prints out the number plus the string indicating it's even. It doesn't print out the number by itself. However, for other numbers like number 5, because we don't have the continue statement, it will print out the 5 can be divided by 5 and execute this line at the end. Alright, so we know the continue will skip the rest of the statements and go to the next loop. How about break? Now, let's add a break statement in the else if statement. Basically, this break will just terminate the while loop. So if this works, when we first encounter a number that can be divided by 5, the while loop will be terminated. Now let's run the program. There we go. We can see that it prints out 2, 3, 4, 5 and stopped right there. It works. Thank you.